Earth from outer space. Give me real, don't give me fake. Open up your eyes. Open up your eyes. Open up your eyes. Just open up your eyes.
About a month ago, I came across some very interesting verses when I was reading, and I thought about sharing it at the time, and then I just held back on that for whatever reason. And lo and behold, recently I had someone send me a message sharing sharing a Bible verse with me, saying, "Hey, you need to check this out." And wouldn't you know it, it was the very verse that I had been looking at already. And it really is very interesting when you start looking at it with new eyes, with open eyes, without the sort of preconceptions that we've actually been approaching the scriptures with for so many years, without even realizing it, I think, in many cases. And this is just such a prime example. So this is from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, starting in verse 35. So I'm just going to start to read through this, and then we can discuss it a little bit. But someone will say, "How are the dead raised up? And with what body do they come?" Foolish one, what you sow is not made alive unless it dies. And what you sow, you do not sow the body that shall be, but mere grain, perhaps a wheat or some other grain. But God gives it a body as he pleases, and to each seed his own body. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of animals, another of fish, and another of birds. There are also celestial bodies and terrestrial bodies, but the glory of the celestial is one, and the glory of the terrestrial is another. There is one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars, for one star differs from another star in glory. So also is the resurrection of the dead. The body is sown in corruption, it is raised in incorruption. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. There is a natural body and there is a spiritual body, and so it is written, the first man Adam became a living being, the last Adam became a life-giving spirit. However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, and afterward the spiritual. The first man was of the earth, made of dust. The second man is the Lord from heaven. As was the man of dust, so also are those who are made of dust. And as is the heavenly man, so are also those who are heavenly. And as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly man. And so I found this to be very interesting. And at first, I think I wasn't sure if maybe I was reading too much into it, because I've just been so fascinated by anything that the Bible has to say about stars or the sun and the moon. And, I think maybe I just wanted to be sure I wasn't trying to read something in there that wasn't in there. Saying something about cosmology or whatever. But if you really just stop and look at this, I really would have to argue that this is absolutely making very plain cosmological statements. Obviously, the point of these verses is not primarily to be making statements about cosmology or about the creation, but about the resurrection. But that's what's interesting, is that it's actually appealing to what the writer is assuming is the reader's understanding of the cosmos as a reference point for what he's talking about regarding terrestrial bodies and heavenly bodies. And what's really interesting is that when you stop and think about this context, that he's talking about the natural versus the spiritual, the earthly versus the heavenly, I mean, that's the whole context of this discussion of the resurrection and what kind of resurrected bodies will be, that they will be heavenly bodies. And so in that context is where he goes to saying, well, there's earthly bodies and heavenly bodies, and the heavenly bodies are the sun, the moon, and the stars. Okay? So once again, if we take that kind of statement and put it back into the original ancient cosmology, the Hebrew cosmology, where the sun, moon, and stars, the heavenly bodies, really are somehow angelically administrated, or some kind of spiritual electromagnetic manifestations, that they are somehow connected to the spiritual dimension, that this verse makes so much more sense. I mean, actually, it's the only way that it makes sense. Otherwise, it's contradicting itself. Because obviously, from the materialistic, heliocentric Copernican paradigm, there's no difference in physicality between earthly bodies and, the sun, moon, and stars. They're all just matter and energy interacting in the physical world. And obviously, we're talking about a very important theological topic here. We're talking about a very core doctrine of Christian faith when you're talking about the resurrection. So it's just kind of amazing to me that he's actually appealing to a cosmological understanding to explain something that is such a central teaching. Because, like I said, clearly what he's laying out is the categorical distinction between natural bodies and spiritual bodies, terrestrial bodies and celestial bodies. And it's interesting when you start reading through commentaries and such on this verse, you start to find that you just kind of get this same generic, really superficial treatment of the text, where they just kind of focus on the wording of the glory, the appearance. It's like when they talk about the glory of the sun versus the glory of the moon, and the stars differing from each other in glory. This very superficial kind of idea of, well, there's all this variety in creation and variation and that sort of concept. But again, that really flies in the face of the whole point of what is being talked about. Because when you're talking about earthly bodies versus spiritual bodies, terrestrial bodies versus celestial bodies, you're not just talking about, well, they're different in appearance, they're different in quote-unquote glory. You're talking about bodies that are categorically different. I mean, dimensionally different, as it were. And all we have to do is look to the resurrected body of Jesus and see what he was capable of doing in terms of walking through walls and disappearing and reappearing. But it's also still physical, to where they could touch him and he could eat. But at the same time, he still looked completely human. So the whole point is not talking necessarily about outward appearance. It's talking about a categorical distinction. And it's also interesting to stop and think about the fact that it chooses to mention the glory of the sun, the glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars, okay? And even the stars differing, but sun, moon, stars, just like we see in Genesis, where you have those three distinct elements of creation, three distinct classes, if you will, as opposed to the Copernican idea that all the stars are just distant suns. But the Bible never makes that equation. And they come up for excuses, excuses about that, because that's just how it appeared to the ancient peoples, because the sun is so much bigger and everything. But again, this is not really being faithful to the text. This is injecting our own modern presuppositions upon the text. And it's just bad hermeneutics. It's bad exegesis. And that's what's really been just being impressed upon me more and more as I just kind of going back and forth throughout the Bible and having kind of new eyes and seeing these things and just seeing how simple it is. This verse in particular really helps kind of push the point about the whole matter of the definition of the term heaven or heavenly itself. And I've been looking into that, which is in the New Testament is the Greek word Ouranos, which just means the heights, or the lofty heights, the sky, basically. And this is this one word, or variations of this one word, that are used throughout the New Testament, whether Jesus is talking about the kingdom of heaven or my heavenly Father, in all these contexts that are clearly spiritual. But also when it talks about the birds of the air, it's the same word, So it's the same sky, the atmosphere, it's used completely interchangeably. And when you look at virtually all lexicon definitions of this word Ouranos, it's always broken up into these, two-handed definitions, sort of this either or of either A, the visible heavens, the atmosphere, and the stars and everything, or the spiritual heavens. One being just the physical vaulted expanse of the sky and all the things you can see in it, where the clouds and the birds and the thunder and lightning and all that. And beyond that, there's the sidereal heavens, or the starry heavens, where the sun, moon, and stars and the planets and all that stuff supposedly is. And then above that, you would have the eternal and angelic and spiritual realm of heaven. And so it's this three-tiered concept that is ubiquitous in all of modern theology. And yet, this is something that we're completely injecting into the meaning. It's not derived from the cultural context, it's not derived from the textual context, and it's even in complete contrast to the theological context, which is supposed to be the most important aspect of the scriptures overall, is the theological message that is being taught. But yet when you look at examples like 1 Corinthians 15, the Copernican model actually is, a Copernican interpretation of this text actually works to pull apart the correct theological point being made rather than reinforce it. So I think that's pretty telling, and I think it really serves as a good point for those who say that, well, this cosmology stuff has nothing to do with the gospel or salvation. It has no real theological import, when I think the more you really stop and look at it, it clearly does. Because what you're left with, once you set aside those presuppositions, once you stop injecting a modern Copernican interpretation upon words like Ouranos, you're left with a simultaneous interpretation. Meaning that just like the word, the simplistic treatment of the word would imply, that the one word referring to both the sky, the airy blue sky overhead with the birds and the clouds and the lightning and the wind, and the celestial bodies of the sun, moon, and the stars, and the spiritual realm, all at the same time. And that, amazingly enough, is exactly the kind of concept that the enclosed cosmology that the original ancient Hebrew cosmology portrays. So at what point are all these factors enough as they come together to make us stop and rethink, and maybe just consider the idea that we've been guilty of a bad hermeneutic, of a false hermeneutic, and we've been unfaithful to the literal meaning of Scripture? Thanks for watching.